The previous tutorial, we show you how you can install the Eiffel Testing Framework or ETF generator on your own computer. And just to remind you about the procedure, we actually created a directory called ETF somewhere in your file system. For example, in my computer, I created ETF under my desktop, and we actually created an exe directory to store the executable for the ETF generator. You actually use this executable to generate ETF projects for your later projects and lab test. And we also downloaded the math models, which is a library that all your ETF projects will depend on. Okay, so make sure you store the ETF directory somewhere safely in your file system. And we also show you in the last video how you can generate your first ETF projects using some sample definitions file. We'll talk about the details a little bit later in this tutorial. But let me just remind you about the structure that we created last time. Remember, we actually, in our 3311 workspace, we created a project directory called ETF bank. And in there, we actually downloaded 3 files. And the first one is called definitions.txt. And this is actually used to generate your ETF projects. And we also downloaded 2 files that will be executed by the build projects. One is for the inputs, like a valid input. The other one is for the input that will actually trigger some error messages. We actually look at them in details for this tutorial. And remember, we also try to compile the generated projects by using the commands on the terminal, using the EC Eiffel compiler command. And we actually compile that on the bank.ecf. So this is actually like an equivalent action of doing the compilation on Eiffel Studio. I was just showing you an alternative way of doing it. Okay, if you look at the definitions.txt, so this is actually the file that Eiffel, that ETF generator used to generate your current ETF projects. So we'll have a look at we have a closer look on this file in this tutorial. So we actually declare, so system is basically like a keyword you have to use. In the first line, you say system, and then now we say the system we are trying to build is called bank. Okay, that is why if you go back to the generated directory, you can see there is a directory called bank. Okay, so there's another directory called docs for documentation. IFGENS was generated by the Eiffel compiler when you try to finalize your projects. And also, the generated code directory contains all sorts of artifacts that are automatically generated for you. So typically, you do not have to modify any of the files or classes inside the generated code. Okay, that's why they're called generated code. Typically, you only have to go to the directory, in this case, bank, that corresponds to the system name in your definitions.txt file. And also, we have a root class, which is something that we have to show you in this video to see how you can launch your projects in different modes. Okay, and also we have the tests directory where you can actually do different sorts of tests, which we'll talk about. If not in this tutorial, maybe later on in the lecture. Okay, so in this definitions.txt, we declare a system called bank, and we also include definitions for the type. Okay, so we actually have a type called day, and day is actually an integer interval from 1 up to 31. So you can see the type is a keyword, and equals its necessary syntax, and dot dot is actually for specifying integer interval. Similarly, we also have a type called month, which will go from 1 to 12. And also we have a type called year, and it simply goes from 1800 to 2500. And we also have a data type called dates, and it simply is a tuple with 3 elements. The first element can be accessed using the identifier D, and that is of type day, as we define here. And the second element here can be accessed using the name M. And the type of M would be month, which is defined here. And similarly, we have year, which is defined here. Okay, and now, so these are called the type synonyms, which means they are the type definitions which you can use when you actually define your events. Okay, I'm actually going to make a clear distinction between events and features. So features are Eiffel specific programming constructs that we have learned so far. In this ETF, Eiffel testing framework series, we're actually going to introduce you to a new notion, which is called events, which is totally different from features that are actually internal to your code or to your design. Okay, in this case, in the definitions file, apparently, so here in the definitions.txt, we are not writing Eiffel programs. We are actually simply defining some, we call the abstract user interface for your system. We will talk about more details in the lecture, but for this tutorial, I just want to give you a first overview of the difference between events and features. So the first event we declare is called new, and which will take, so you can see if you only by looking at the decorations of the events, they are similar to the Eiffel features. We try to make the style consistent so you don't have to learn any new syntax. However, their meanings are very different. You really have to distinguish between the meanings of events and features. Okay, so we have an event called new. We have an event called deposit, which will take some ID of type string and will deposit some amount of real number, and also will actually deposit on a particular dates. And similarly for withdrawal, and in the case of transfer, we actually transfer from ID1, some account identifier, to another account identifier with some amount, and also on a particular dates. So let me bring you some notes to actually briefly tell you the difference between events and features. So I'll just go line by line. I have some notes here. So when you develop your application software, so far you actually implement classes and features. So these are specific to Eiffel or specific to a programming language. But after you actually have tested your classes and features and you are confident that you have implemented your software correctly, what you will do is you will actually have to finalize your application as a standalone executable for your clients to use. And at this point, once you got executable, and you might just give your clients the executable to use. In this case, all the classes and features, they are actually very implementation specific, will be invisible to the clients. That should be quite straightforward. And in this case, typically, the users will interact with your application via some GUI, some graphical user interface. So the idea about defining the events, like a new deposit, withdraw, and transfer in the case of bank, is to have an abstract version of the GUI. So we don't actually have to create a GUI per se, but we can actually represent what are the buttons or what are the possible constructs of the GUI. So for example, if you consider this real application of an ATM machine, so you can consider that each button here, for example, for you to enter your account name, for you to enter your password, and to select the actions you would like to perform on your account to, for example, withdraw cash, deposit, or to do some transfer, and etc. You can also enter the keypad. So each button click represents some interaction with the underlying software. So each button click, you can think of that as an external event that actually occurred between the interaction of you as a user and the application software. And as you click on the button, it's actually going to send some messages to the internal software, and the software is going to call the corresponding internal features that actually has been finalized, but they are invisible as far as the clients are concerned. Okay, that's really the crucial difference between events, which are external, and also features, they are actually internal. Okay, so let me just finish my notes. So you really have to distinguish between events and features. So features are the Eiffel constructs that you have experienced so far. The new notion is called events. Okay, events are external and they are actually observable when you execute an application via the GUI, for example, the button clicks. And also each event represents an interaction between users and the application. For example, like a button click on the ATM machine or like a keypad press on the machine. So when an event occurs, its effects on the system, for example, the ATM machine or your bank account, is going to be completed via some sequence of execution of feature calls. Of course, those feature calls are hidden from you as a client. And now, on the other hand, for the features which you are quite familiar with, they are somehow internal because when you are actually when you are using some application software, usually you don't actually see the source code of the application. So all the features, all the classes, they're actually hidden from you. That's why I said it's invisible. When you actually interact with the application, all you have is a graphical user interface. And each feature call refers to the execution of just some fragment of the hidden code. Okay, so please review these notes once more to actually convince yourself that events are basically constitute the abstract GUI of your application for the users of your application to perform interactions. And also features are are the hidden code that are the hidden parts. They're actually the parts that are actually hidden when you actually build your projects as an executable. Okay, that's the difference between events and features. And the idea about the Eiffel testing framework is for you to specify the possible events that might occur, which means the possible interactions that might occur between the between the users and your application. Okay, so in the definitions file that you actually use to generate your first ETF projects, they are basically declaring the possible events that might occur between the users of your bank software and the bank software itself. So now we'd say we might have some new account creation events, we might have some amount deposit events, we might have some withdrawal events, and we might have some transfer events. Of course, internally, if you actually click on the deposit button on your application, it might internally call the corresponding features to execute the effects. Okay, like a features. Okay, so that's about the difference between events and features. So now let's uh, actually try to actually recompile our ETF projects. I just want to show you that. So this is what we were left off from the last tutorial. We haven't changed anything. I just want to show you that whenever you generate an ETF project, you can already start playing with it because it's already a standalone application. Okay, first of all, this is always a good practice. Let's say if you want to start again to develop your projects, it's always good to delete the ifgens folder and then recompile from scratch. Okay, so you can, if you're actually in the prison lab, what you can do is you can simply run a command called eclean. Okay, you can simply go to the ETF bank directory and then say eclean dot. But if you're using your own PC or Mac or Linux machine, you may not have this eclean command supported. If that's not, don't panic too much. You can just delete the ifgens manually, like what I'm going to do now. I will select that and now just delete that to the recycle bin. Okay, and now we don't actually have the generated ifgens anymore. So now we're going to recompile from scratch. This time, instead of doing that from the command line, I'm going to do it from the Eiffel Studio. Okay, so now I'm going to launch Eiffel Studio. Okay, and then I'm going to launch it. Okay, so make sure you actually add a project. In this case, I actually make sure I select, you can say add projects, and then make sure you select the right workplace and also the projects, and select the ECF file, and then because we have gotten rid of the ifgens folder already, so I'm going to say compile. Okay, open that, and then we'll wait a bit for that to compile. For the purpose of this tutorial, you don't really have to understand the exact structure of the generated ETF projects. I will only show you the class that you need to know in order to play with different modes of launching the ETF application. Okay, so basically, if you go to the course wiki, okay, that's the course wiki page for software design summer 2015. If you go under tests exam, you will see that under the lab test preparation, and we already have some video, so the series of videos can be accessed from here, and also we have different steps. We just completed steps 1 and 2 from the last tutorial. If you haven't done that, please complete it before you continue with this tutorial. In this tutorial, we are actually going to show you how you can play with the different modes of the default generated ETF projects. And there are basically 3 possible modes you can launch your ETF projects already, even before you make your first change. So basically, we can do either to launch the ETF projects as a GUI, which we actually saw briefly from the last tutorial, and also we can actually, the later 2 modes are actually launched from the command line. So we can either to interact with the application by saying I type a command, I see some output, and I'll type another command, and then we'll see another output. It's like a interactive game basically. And also we have the batch mode, which means we can actually give a series of events to the to specify the events in a text file, and then we can feed the whole entire text file into the ETF application, and then it's going to output in one go. That's basically what a batch mode will do. Okay, so now we are finished with the compilation. So I will draw your attention, as I said before, you do not have to worry about the generated code cluster or directory. Later on, we actually show you that the bank cluster will be the only cluster you may have to modify in order to implement your own business logic, okay? But that's not the focus of this tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll show you that you have to go under the root cluster, go to the root class. This is where you can switch between the modes for running your ETF projects. That's the focus for this video. Okay, let me just make it maximized. And now, what we need to do is have a look at here. So you can see that for this class, you only have to pay attention to the first 2 feature sections, okay? The first feature sections called constants actually specify the possible modes that you can actually you can choose to run for your ETF. Every time, if you change from one mode to another, you have to recompile or to freeze your code to actually create a new version of the working code before that new change will take in effect. I will show you exactly what I meant. So basically, we have different modes. So we have unit test mode. In this case, if you actually so you have different modes. You have 1, 2. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we actually have the name for the modes. Okay, so every time you want to switch from one mode to another, you're going to quote the names of the mode. So how do you do that? So the second feature section here called attributes, we have an attribute called switch. You can see the switch is of the type that's consistent with the constants here. Okay, so now you can see that currently, actually by default, it's actually the GUI mode that we actually was assigned to. So that's the default. So let me just show you actually what I meant. So by default, you will be the GUI, but you can switch from one to another whenever necessary. Okay, let me just replace it back. I actually just changed the mode before I started the tutorial, but by default, this is what you will see. Okay, so now you can see that we have a GUI mode. We have 2 modes that they are directly the GUI mode, and one is to say show the history. The other one is to hide the history. Okay, both belong to the GUI mode, as you can see from the comments. Okay, another 2, CL stands for command line. Okay, so from the command line, we can actually run the batch mode or the interactive mode. I'll show you all the modes together. I just want to go over first. Okay, again, for the command line mode, similar to the GUI mode, we can say either to show the history or to hide the history. Okay, so if you want to switch from, for example, unit test, let's say by default, it's the ETF GUI mode that shows the history. Let's say if you want to go from this mode to command line show history, what you have to do is directly just copy this name here and then replace that here and then recompile. That's all you have to do. Okay, let me just go to the default first and then let's just go one by one. Okay, let's first go to the default, which is GUI show history. Okay, I make a change and now what you have to do is to say freeze. Okay, because somehow, let me show you one thing. So if you go to your directory here, so that's the ifgens here. If you go into ifgens and you go into bank, so you only have to pay attention to two directories here, fcode and wcode. So under fcode, currently fcode is empty because remember we actually deleted ifgens and we just recompile from scratch. So fcode contains the finalized executable. So it only is non-empty when you actually finalize your project. But up to the tutorial so far, we haven't done that yet in the current tutorial video. All we have done is just to compile the working code. So if you actually see the W code here, you can see that we actually have W code and we have the bank. So this is the executable of the current working code. So the W here stands for working. So later on, if you actually finalize your projects, as you can see under compile, if you click on the down arrow here, you can see you can either to say compile or you can say freeze. Freeze means you want to recompile from scratch and then to generate the executable for the current working code in the W code directory. On the other hand, the finalize command is going to finalize your projects to optimize your C code and then I mean to optimize the generated C code from the Eiffel compiler and then to generate some more efficient executable for your projects in the F code directory. Okay, that's the difference, either to freeze or to finalize. If you freeze, it's going to regenerate an executable, which is not so efficient, but it'll be quick. It's a much quicker process than finalizing your projects. So when you freeze, it's going to regenerate an executable under W code. If you say finalize, it's going to generate the most efficient and optimized executable under F code. Okay, but now we don't necessarily have to finalize our code yet. We can just freeze. Okay. Later on, let's say if you have to submit some executable for your project or lab test, you better finalize your code and submit the executable from there rather than freezing it. Because when you submit, you want to submit the most efficient and optimized version of your project build. Okay, so now we're going to go into compile and then we'll say freeze. Okay, it's actually incremental process for compilation. So typically freeze is actually quite quick. Okay, it's done already. So now you can see that we simply have, so the current mode is actually ETF GUI mode show history. So if now we say run, okay, so there are two ways to run it. Either you can run from Eiffel Studio, or I'll show you both ways, or you can run it from the command line. Okay, by actually invoking the executable under the W code directory. Okay, I'll show you both. So first of all, we can run. What you expect to see is you actually see the GUI, and somehow the GUI will show the history. Okay, so if we click on run, you can see that now we have the GUI here. So let me just briefly introduce you to the GUI, but you can play with that also yourself. Okay, so you can see that we have different panels and text box here. So here we have a text box. Here is where you can enter the events that actually occurs, or like the interaction that occurs between the user and the application. Okay, and this output panel here, so this is a text field for you to enter the events. And here you have execute, you have reset, you have load. Execute means as soon as you actually finish entering your command, you can either hit enter or you can click on execute to say, now I want to execute this event and take that into effect to the system. If you say reset, it's going to actually clear what you have done so far and reset the system. Okay, and load is actually good. Well, because we actually show you that under the hood, as you actually are executing a sequence of events on your system, some history file called session.txt will be generated in the same project directory. So that means, let's say if you terminate the current GUI session and launch it again, what you can do is you can simply say load, and it's actually going to load from the session.txt to make sure you can bring you up to the last state that you just ended your previous session. I'll show you exactly what I meant. Okay, and then here, this panel here is actually for the output states. So by default, we simply just say system states, and we have some default model states, and we just have some counter from zero, counting from zero, just default. Later on, you will be required to change the business logic such that you will display the relevant information for a bank. Okay, but that's just a default behavior that's generated by the ETF generator. Okay, that's for the output states. And here, initially, in the status panel, it's going to show you the list of commands or events that can be executed on your system. So we have, so you can see that these lists of commands or events correspond to the that definitions file that we actually used to generate your current ETF projects. No surprise, they just match with each other. They are completely consistent. There should be no surprise. Okay, we have new, deposit, withdraw, and transfer. Over here, you can see that we have new, we have deposit, we have withdraw, and we have transfer. So initially, this is like when you call man on your Linux terminal. So this is like a list of commands that you can use for your bank system. If you enter anything that's other than new, deposit, withdraw, or transfer, you're actually going to have error. Okay, simply that the event doesn't exist. Okay, only 1, 2, 3, 4. Only these 4 events are defined for your system because that's what the definitions file says. Okay, and this right-hand side panel here is called the history panel, which means whatever commands you have executed so far is going to be recorded over there as a trace for your system. Okay, let me demonstrate this to you. So initially we have the model states 0 with a counter starting with 0. Now let's say I just want to add a new command called bill, okay, because you can see that new is going to take some ID of type string. So you can see that I actually put a string bill within double quotes for the new. Now I can either hit enter or I can say click on execute. Either way, let me hit enter. If I do that, you can see now we don't have the manual anymore. It's just gone. Okay, that's expected. But now you can see the system model states goes from 0 to 1. That means we have executed something, but since we haven't really implemented the business logic yet, that will be your task later. But that's actually just the default behavior. It just shows that something has happened. So in this case, we just increment the counter from 0 to 1. And now in the history panel here, you can see that new bill is actually the last event we have executed. Okay, let me try another one. So if I say new string with double quotes, let's say Steve. Now I'm going to click on the execute button here. If I do that, you can see now we actually go from 1 to 2. As for the counter, that means something else again happened, and now the history trace has been expanded with one command. You can see the very first command we did was called Bill, and the second command we did was Steve. Okay, that should be of no surprise to you. And now about a load function, let me show you. So if you go to the project directory, which is under ETF Bank, right? So now you can see that this file called session.txt is automatically generated in the GUI mode as soon as you actually enter the first command for your GUI. If you look at that, it has exactly the trace that corresponds to the history panel in your GUI. Okay, it is just there, which means if I terminate the GUI session and then launch a new one, the session.txt will still be there. What I can do is I can simply say load from the very beginning, and it's actually going to save me from typing new Bill and new Steve again, and it's going to load directly into that particular states. Okay, this is actually very useful later on when you want to do some testing. You don't actually have to manually type your command anymore. You just have to give a file. Okay, let me just do maybe one more. So now, let's say you used to be able to see the list of commands or events that you can execute on your system, but now they're gone. The way to bring it back is simply to say man, standing for manual. If you do man, you can see that there's also some hints for you here. Enter command man for options. If you do that, so now we actually have the status panel showing all the commands again. You can do new, you can do deposit, you can do withdraw, or you can do transfer. And notice one thing, you can type man here. Man is the only command or events that is not defined in here. That's the only one that's allowed. Okay, as you can see, even though the last event, a command I typed was man, but now the man is not added to the history. Okay, that's just expected because man is like a auxiliary query that we support for you to know, to remind you about what can be entered. And one thing to draw your attention to is you can see for each of the events here, it shows the signature of the events. As I said before, they corresponds to exactly the definitions file that you used to generate your ETF projects. Okay, so now let me show you one more thing. So now let's say I want to do a transfer. Let me just do deposit first. Okay, if I say deposit, you can see the deposit will take 3 arguments here. So the first argument will be a name. Let's say we want to deposit into Bill's account, and then with some real number, you can see the second argument is a real number. So we can say 2.0, comma. Okay, arguments are separated by comma. And now we can do a dates. And dates is simply a tuple with 3 arguments. So the first argument is of type of an integer from 1 to 31. And the second one is from 1 to 12 for month. And the third one is from 1800 to 2500. So what I can do is to specify a tuple. And the tuple in Eiffel is specified using a square brackets. And now the first one will be a date. Let's say I want to say let's say the 30th of April. Actually, just put today's date maybe. So 24th of June 2015. Okay. If I do that, okay, you can see that this is successfully executed. Okay. But now let's say if sometimes you might accidentally actually enter something that's wrong. So there are two kinds, the two common mistakes you might make is you might either get a syntax wrong or you might get a type wrong. Okay, let me show you both. Let's say for the case of the new, let's say you forgot to specify the string properly. Let's say I want to add Peter into the bank. You can see that I missed a string quote. If you do that, hit enter, it actually tells you that the last command you enter, which is new Peter, but without a closing quote, you actually have some syntax error, and it actually gives you some error message here. Okay, that means you got syntax error. So now what I can do is I can fix that by adding a closing quote, and I can say execute again. So now I do have the Peter there. Okay, so this is the one I just demonstrated was a syntax error that you might have. Let me show you that when you get the syntax right, the type may not be correct. Okay, let me just go man again. Okay, what if I'd say I want to do a sort? Okay, just for fun, just do a sort. Let's say I want to sort some sort. I'll just say 2, for example. So this one has no syntax error because it's a name for the events. It has opening and closing parentheses, it has an argument value. If I do this, it tells me that the unknown event name sort, right? Because remember, we only have deposit, withdraw, transfer, and new. So sort is simply not defined. Okay, let me just so this is one possible type error you might have. So let's say man again. So now let's say we have to do a new. New is defined, but now if I say new 2, you can see 2 is actually an integer, right? 2 is an integer, but the new events is expecting an ID of type string. If you do that, it's going to tell you that the new 2 that I passed does not conform to the declaration of new, which expects a string. Okay, that should be straightforward to understand. Okay, let me do a final one. Amend. Okay, let's say we want to do a deposit. Let me just save some typing by copy this. Okay, so now let's say I actually put, you can see the day should be from 1 to 31. So this is actually some integer interval. But if somehow I put 32 here, it actually is going to complain to me that you have 32 here, however, day is only from 1 to 31. So that's another type error you might get. Okay, you can play with this GUI and see what kind of error you can get. Okay, so let me close this terminate this current session of the GUI and show you one more about how to load. Okay, if I simply close this, okay, and now I can launch it again. And the way we launched it before was simply to say run for Eiffel Studio. This is one way to do it. Okay, let me show you another way to do it. Another way to do it, so currently we are in my home directory. So let me go to the Eiffel workspace, ETF Bank, and now you can see we have the iFgens. So we actually go into iFgens and the projects, and then W code, because we haven't finalized our project yet. So we want to actually see the executable built from your working code. W code, and then we'll go for bank. So this is the second way of launching the application. If we do that, okay. So now I want to show you how the load works. If you go to your project directory, you can see that the session.txt actually records all the commands that we used to have, right? You can see that we have new Bill, new Steve, deposit, and new Peter. If I close that, now if I say load, it's actually going to load every command that we have executed so far. You can see that it actually shows me that we have new Bill, new Steve, deposit, and new Peter. Okay, that's actually, you can see the convenience of this. You actually don't have to type all the previous 4 commands or 4 events into your GUI from scratch. What you can do is you can simply let it load from the session.txt that was actually recorded from the previous section. So that's the idea about a history of trace of events. Okay, that's just one way to save your typing and to automate your test cases. Okay, that's how you do load. Okay, and one more, if you do reset, is that you can see that currently, currently we have executed 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 commands. So what we can do is we can say reset. If we say reset, and it's actually going to reset the history. So now that means if we say new Bill again, you can see that now we are back to the states where the counter is defaulted back to 0 after reset, and that's why after we say Bill, now we actually have the counter back to 1 again. Okay, just shows you that the resets basically the business model or the underlying model, and then actually just basically resets everything. So it's as if you didn't execute any commands at all. Okay, so you might reset sometimes, or you might terminate your GUI and then to load from the previous section, or you can just execute command one by one. Okay, play with the GUI, and it's not so bad. It's not so difficult to learn. Okay, so now let me close the GUI mode. So what I have shown you is this ETF GUI show history. So now it should be very straightforward to know what to expect. If we say ETF GUI hide history, Okay, let me just show you that. So now I'm going to change the switch from GUI show history into GUI hide history. Okay, I'm going to say freeze. Okay, it's going to compile quickly. Yep. So now if I launch it again, okay, of course this is one way. The other way to do it is by running the bank executable from the W code in your iFgens. Okay, I'm going to just launch it from Eiffel Studio. Now this time, what we will expect to see is the right-hand side panel for the history will be hidden. Okay, sometimes you may not want to see the history, you just want to see the GUI itself. Okay, so you can see the difference now. So everything remains the same, except we actually don't have that right panel of history anymore. Okay, that's the difference between the two possible ways of showing the GUI mode. Okay, so what we have seen so far is the ETF GUI show history and also the same GUI mode but hide the history. Okay, so these are the two modes we have introduced. You can simply copy and paste the string constants to the right hand side of the assignments for the switch. Okay, so now for the unit test, it will be also very easy. So if you actually change the right hand side to be unit test, then what you have to do is to simply add your own test cases here. So that's exactly the same as before as you did for your test-driven development project. You just add your own test classes here, and then because you can see that the current root class also inherits from ES Suite. So what you should do, if you change the switch from, let's say, this switch here to the unit test, if you do that, what you should do is you should add some test cases to your projects. And what you should do is, let me show you briefly, you should know how to do that yourself. Since we created some tests directory here in the file system, so you should really go to projects and project settings, and then under groups, then here under cluster, you should create a new cluster called tests. We didn't do that for you by default, so you're expected to do it yourself if you want to have a test cluster. Okay, and then once you create a test cluster, you can create different subclasses of the ES test class. Add the test cases there, and then you can gradually add the test class under this feature here called add tests. And then once you're done with that, what you can do is to run and then say run workbench system. Okay, that's how it works for the unit test mode. Okay. That's something you should just be able to do by yourself. I'll leave that as an exercise for you. So let's have a look quickly on the final two modes that I would like to show you for this tutorial. So we have seen so far the unit test, we have seen the GUI mode, either show or hide history. So now for the command line, CL stands for command line, we also have again show or hide history. Okay, for the command line, basically that means we have to go from the command line, right? So everything has to be specified from the command line. So let's say ETF command line mode, but now we'll say show history. Okay, so now we'll say freeze. It shouldn't take long. Okay, it's generating. Yep, it's done. So now that means we cannot launch from Eiffel Studio anymore because that means command line mode. Okay, what we should do is, so now let me just clear my terminal so it's clearer for you to see. So now we are under ETF Bank. So this is the path to the executable in the working code. If we so now we are actually running in the command line mode. If you simply do that as before, now it actually shows a different behavior because we just recompile the switch from GUI mode into command line mode. In the command line mode, you must specify a mode. So now it tells you what to do. So if you're not sure about what mode to be used, you should really ask for help by saying the same command dash help. Okay, if you do that, it's actually going to give you a detailed usage manual for the command line mode. You actually basically have different modes. Okay, first of all, again, it has a GUI mode, so don't get too confused. That means in the command line mode, you also have a way to launch the GUI. But in the GUI mode, you just launch the GUI directly without any other choices. Okay, just a convenience. So if you say in the command line mode, if you say -G, you can launch the GUI. I'll show you. And also, if you say -I, that means you're going to launch the interactive mode. If you say -B, it's actually going to show you the batch mode, which means you have to give a some input.txt file, which I will show you as well. The window mode is a more advanced mode, which you don't have to worry about for this tutorial. We'll show you that later, either in the lecture or in a later tutorial video. All you have to know is about these three options. Okay, so now what you have to do is make sure you can actually launch this help page and make sure you can see the explanations for the -G for GUI mode, for the GUI mode, and also -I for the interactive mode, and -B for the batch mode. Okay, all of these have to be launched from the command line. Okay, let me show you the GUI mode first. That's the command. If we say -G, remember from our last compilation, we actually say command line show history. That means if we say -G to launch the GUI, it is going to show the history. Okay, exactly. So you can see that everything exactly like before in the GUI mode, but now we're just trying to launch the GUI mode from the command line. Okay, so now you can see the history. You also have the panel here for the output. You also have the command here, just as before. So I don't have to repeat the explanation for this. Let's have a look at the the other two modes. So now the same executable. Now we can say -I. That means interactive, which means you have to interact with the terminal like a game. If you type enter, okay, it shows you the default states. Okay, like in the GUI mode, it also shows you the default states with a counter starting from 0. So now I can say new. First of all, I can say man. It actually shows me basically what commands I can type, right? So now what I can do is I can say new Steve. In this case, of course, there's no session.txt. There's no way to load. The load function is only for the GUI mode, not for the command line mode. Okay, that's something you have to bear in mind. So if I say new Steve, so now you can see the default model states goes from 0 to 1. That means something has happened. To actually make sure what happens has the meaningful effects on your system states, you have to redefine the business logic, which will be the focus for in the next few videos, not the current one. Okay, let me just do another one. So we have new Bill, we have new Steve, we have new Steve. Let's say we want to deposit into the Steve. Okay, make sure you close the quotes appropriately. So now deposit is going to take a string, takes a real number, 2.0, and it's going to take a tuple of 3 elements. Okay, so it's going to be a date. So let's say today, 24th of June 2015. Okay, if you do that, right, it properly executes and tells you now successfully increments the counter from 1 to 2. So the counter increment is simply a default behavior that's generated for your ETF projects. You can redefine that by yourself later, not now. Okay, now if you actually want to exit, to quit from the interactive mode, just say quit. Okay, that's how you quit from the interactive mode. Again, to run the interactive mode, you have to refer to the executable in the W code. If you have just freeze the code, you may have to refer to the F code. If you have just finalized the code, that's the difference. Okay, you will say -I here, that for interactive mode. Now for the batch mode, which means you have to pass some file. If you simply say that, you can say I said -B without a file name. It tells you that you have the wrong number of arguments for the -B mode, which means you have to include a file. Okay. So what you gotta do is to include the input.txt that we downloaded from the last tutorial. So we have this input here. You can see that's simply a series of commands like a new Bill, new Steve, deposit. Like this is like a use case. A use case, a use case file consists of a series of commands. And by the way, for the use case file, you can always do the comments for your use case. You can say new account of Bill. Okay, the comments will just be ignored in the execution. So they are actually for documentation purpose. So you can say new account of, okay, something like that. You can document the rest yourself. So here, input.txt is simply a use case that consists of a sequence of events. Okay, it's like a trace, like a history. Okay, so in some way, it's like a load. Okay, yeah. So now let's do -b, and now where is it? So you can see now we are actually in the same directory in the project. We're going to refer to input.txt, input.txt. Okay, if we simply do that, you can see that it actually shows you from here to here. So you can see we actually have executed new Bill, new Steve, deposit Bill, deposit Steve, withdraw Bill, and then transfer from Steve to Bill. That corresponds to exactly the input.txt we just saw. Let me make sure. Let me just go to that text file. You can see that one, new Bill, new Steve, deposit, deposit, withdraw, and transfer. Okay, just corresponds to that with the proper increments, like the default increments of the counters. Okay, so now we can also do input bat.txt. That's the other use case file that we downloaded from the last tutorial. If you do that, it actually shows you some error message. Okay, it will be, so this is left as an exercise for you to actually figure out why we actually have the input bat.txt, but in this case, it actually contains some illegal inputs, and this is left to you as an exercise to find out. Okay, you can read the error message and try to get familiar with the error reporting from the generated ETF projects. Okay, one more thing to show you, so you can see the default behavior for the batch mode is simply to put. So basically, we are trying to execute your application on this input use case file. And the default output is just going to be printed in the terminal. But sometimes it will be useful if you can print it to a output.txt, right? So what you can do is you can specify another argument, output.txt. If you do that, it's actually going to create a new file called output.txt. And it contains exactly the output that we just saw on the terminal. Okay, that's for the batch mode. And one more thing I would like to show you, if we go back to Eiffel Studio, we have just shown you the command line mode that shows the history. Okay, so now let's say we want to change from that into command line, but now we want to hide the history. Okay, let me make sure I do that properly. Okay, now let's say we freeze. So basically, the only difference between command line show history and command line hide history, the only difference is when you use the -G option to launch the GUI, one is going to show the history panel, the other one is going to hide the history panel. But in terms of the -I and for the interactive mode, and also -B for the batch mode, for these two switch values, they are exactly the same. It's only -G that's going to show the difference. Okay, so now we have freeze the code. So now if we try again with the -G, we should expect not to see the history panel anymore. Exactly. Okay, so now you get the point, hopefully. Okay, so now this is what this is really the focus of this video. We would like to show you that you should really try to recompile your generated ETF projects and go into the root cluster and go to root class. And then you actually only have to pay attention to 3 feature sections. The first one is the constant section that shows there are 5 possible switch value you can specify for your project. And you actually have a switch query here, and you can actually change the right hand side at your own discretion. You can actually change to whatever value that's needed. So you can either do a unit test, in which case you have to add your test classes here like before. If you're not sure about that, refer to our previous tutorial series on the TDD. And also you have two possible ways to go to the Gui mode. And for the Gui mode, you can either show or hide the history. To launch the Gui mode, you can either to say run from Eiffel Studio, okay? Or you can simply just launch the executable directly without specifying any option there, okay? Either way. Now, the last two modes is the command line mode. If you think about that, command line mode means you cannot launch that from Eiffel Studio, right? So what you have to do is to either to show or hide the history again. So now in the command line mode, you can either say -G for GUI, -I for interactive mode, or -B for the batch mode, in which case you either just pass an input.txt and then it's going to output to the terminal. Or you can also specify the output.txt and it's going to redirect the outputs to that particular file you specify. Okay, so these are the possible modes you can actually launch. You can use to launch your ETF application. Okay, so your task now is try to reproduce what I have done so far in this tutorial and make sure you get familiar, get yourself familiar with all the possible modes or switch values for launching your ETF projects. Okay, in the next tutorial, next few tutorial in the series, we actually show you that how you can actually redefine the behavior for your bank. Okay, because currently it's only showing that you are just gradually incrementing some counter value as a default behavior, but that's not really what a bank would do. But we actually show you, you as the developer, you actually have to, let me give you some preview, you as developer, you actually have to go under, we call the business logic cluster. So bank here corresponds to the, if you go back to definitions.txt, bank corresponds to the system name that you actually define in the definitions.txt. Remember, you actually use this file to generate the current ETF projects, right? We'll show you that later on. If you want to override the default behavior of the business model, which is a bank, you have to go to several classes under the bank cluster, which we'll show you in details in the next few tutorials. Okay, stay watching.